The letter arrived at the Dusty Creek post office on a Thursday morning in the autumn of 1882, folded twice, and sealed with a smear of candle wax, its edges soft from the long journey west, as if even the paper had grown weary of traveling so far from home. Ruby Wainwright had written it at her kitchen table in Millhaven, Tennessee, with the oil lamp burning low and her 2 children asleep in the next room, and she had not expected anything to come of it. She had not expected anything at all. She had written it because her sister-in-law Cora, who had more optimism than good sense and a fondness for newspaper advertisements, had clipped one from the back of a traveling gazette and slapped it flat on Ruby's table like a trump card. The advertisement read, "Rancher in Dusty Creek, Colorado Territory, seeks capable woman for correspondence. Honest work, honest land, honest intentions. Respond in care of Norris, General Delivery, Dusty Creek." Ruby had read it 3 times and told Cora it was ridiculous. She had written the letter that same night. She told herself it was just to have something to do with her hands. She told herself it was just words on paper, just ink and foolishness, and that no one would read it on the other end anyway. Men who put advertisements in traveling gazettes were either desperately lonely or fundamentally dishonest, and she had already had one husband who turned out to be the second thing, and she had no interest in collecting a matching set. She did not say any of that in the letter. She said only what was true, her name, her age, which was 29. That she had been widowed 14 months prior, when her husband Thomas Wainwright had taken a fever and died without a great deal of warning, and with a great deal of debt. That she had 2 children, a boy named Samuel who was 7, and a girl named Grace who was 5. That she had managed a household for 9 years and could cook, preserve, mend, and tend a garden. That she was not looking for charity. That she was not sure exactly what she was looking for. She sealed it and gave it to Cora to mail because she could not quite bring herself to walk it to the post office herself. And then she put the whole thing out of her mind and went about the hard, grinding business of surviving. 14 months after Thomas died, surviving was still the correct word for what Ruby was doing. It was not living, not precisely. Living implied a certain forward momentum, a certain reaching towards something, and Ruby had not quite managed to reach in any direction since the fever took him. She got up each morning and fed the children, and made the small decisions that kept the 3 of them from sliding off the edge into complete disaster. And then she went to bed at night feeling like a person who had run a very long race without ever crossing a finish line. The debt Thomas had left behind was a particular kind of weight. Not violent debt, nothing criminal, just the slow, ordinary, crushing kind: money borrowed against the farm, supplies bought on credit, a note held by the Millhaven Bank that came due in the spring and that Ruby could not, by any reasonable mathematics, pay. Cora said Colorado. Ruby said Tennessee. Cora said Ruby had to at least try. Ruby mailed the letter. Levi Norris read it for the first time sitting at his kitchen table on a Friday afternoon in October, with dust coming through the windows and the sound of his horses shifting in the corral outside. He was 33 years old. He was a tall man, lean in the way that years of hard work made a man lean, with dark eyes that had a habit of going very still and very focused when he was thinking hard about something. He had been in Dusty Creek for 6 years, having come west from Missouri after a hard winter and a failed harvest, and a general sense that staying put would eventually kill him. He had built the ranch from a quarter section of raw land, adding to it acre by acre until it was a proper operation: cattle, horses, a kitchen garden, a bunkhouse for 3 hands. He had no wife and no children, and a deep private awareness that the place he had built was not quite a home yet, that it lacked some quality he could not name precisely, but recognized by its absence. His friend and neighboring rancher Art Dunbar had convinced him to put the advertisement in the Gazette. Art was happily married to a woman named Della who had come to him via correspondence, and Art was the kind of man who believed fervently that other people should have what he had. Levi had resisted the advertisement for 2 months. He had agreed to it partly to make Art stop talking about it, and partly because of a quiet winter night when the silence in his house had been so complete that it felt less like peace and more like proof of something missing. He had received 4 letters in response. The first 3 he read once each, and set aside with a polite sense that they were not quite right, though he could not have explained precisely what right would feel like. Then Ruby's letter arrived. He read it the first time quickly, the way you read something when you are standing at the mail counter and trying to look like it is not important. Then he took it home and read it again at the kitchen table, more slowly. There was something in the way she wrote that caught at him. Not the content exactly, though the content was honest and direct in a way he appreciated, but something in the voice beneath the words. She did not perform any sweetness. She did not try to sell herself. She simply told the truth, including the part where she admitted she did not know what she was looking for, which struck Levi as the most honest thing he had read in a long time. He read it a 3rd time before he started cooking supper. He read it a 4th time after he ate. He read it a 5th time late in the evening with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and the oil lamp casting a yellow circle on the table. He read it a 6th time in the morning when he woke early, and could not stop thinking about the line where she said she was not looking for charity, the particular fierce quietness of those 5 words, the way they told him something essential about the shape of her without describing her at all. He started to read it a 7th time. He got 3 lines in, to the part where she described her children, the boy who liked to collect rocks and the girl who sang to herself while she worked, and something in his chest shifted in a way that was less like reading and more like recognition. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside his coat pocket, and went to saddle his horse. His ranch hand Eli, a wiry 20-year-old from Texas who had been with Levi for 2 years, saw him come out of the barn with his saddlebag over his shoulder and a look on his face that Eli had learned to read as meaning something had been decided. "You going somewhere, boss?" Eli asked. "Tennessee," Levi said. Eli opened his mouth, closed it again, and then said, "That is a long way." "Yes, it is," Levi agreed. "When will you be back?" Levi thought about Ruby Wainwright, who had sent her last letter west not expecting an answer, who had 14 months of surviving under her and 2 children, and a debt she could not pay, and a fierce private determination not to ask for charity. He thought about the way the letter felt in his coat pocket, warm from being close to his body. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Keep the horses watered and the cattle where they are. Hatch knows what to do." He rode out before Eli could think of anything else to say. The journey from Dusty Creek, Colorado to Millhaven, Tennessee in the autumn of 1882 was not a short one. Levi took the train where he could catch it, which was from the railhead at Pueblo east toward Kansas City, and then again from Kansas City southeast toward Nashville. The parts in between were by horse or by stage. He was not a man given to impatience, but he found himself impatient in a way he could not quite settle, watching the landscape change from the dry brown sweep of the Colorado plains to the greener, softer hills of Missouri and Kentucky, feeling a sense of urgency that he recognized as somewhat irrational and could not dismiss. He had the letter with him the whole time. On the train between Kansas City and Nashville, he read it a 7th time, all the way through, including the part that had stopped him at the ranch. He had heard people say that certain things were fated. He was not a man who put much stock in fate as a rule. He believed more in work and decision than in the invisible arrangement of events. But he could not read that final paragraph of Ruby's letter without feeling that she had addressed it specifically to him, that the particular combination of her honesty and her weariness and her unquenched something reaching towards something fit against an identical space in him, the way a key fits a lock. He did not say this to anyone. He just folded the letter very carefully, put it back in his coat pocket, and watched Tennessee come up through the train window. Millhaven in October was golden and a little melancholy, the way small southern towns get when the summer heat has finally broken, and the leaves are turning and the whole world seems to be breathing out. It was a town of perhaps 800 people, with a main street of wooden storefronts, a church, a school, a bank with a white painted facade, and the particular social geometry of a place where everyone knew everyone's business and discussed it freely. Levi arrived by train on a Tuesday afternoon and asked at the station for directions to the Wainwright farm. The station master, a heavy-set man in a green vest, looked at him with undisguised curiosity and said, "You a relation of hers?" "No," Levi said. "You a friend?" "Not yet," Levi said. The station master gave him directions with the look of a man who intended to discuss this later with his wife, and Levi thanked him and rode out along the road the man had indicated. The Wainwright farm was 3 miles from town. It was a modest place, a white frame house that needed paint, a small barn that needed new shingles on the east side, a kitchen garden where the last of the season's kale was still standing in neat rows. There was a clothesline behind the house with small shirts and a women's apron hanging on it, and there was a child in the yard, a boy of 7 or 8 with brown hair and a handful of rocks, examining each one with the serious attention of a scientist. The boy looked up when Levi came through the gate. "Are you from the post office?" the boy asked. "No," Levi said. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. "My name is Levi Norris. I am looking for Mrs. Wainwright." The boy considered this with the direct, uncomplicated appraisal of a child. "She is inside," he said. "Are you the man from the newspaper?" Levi looked at the boy for a moment. "I might be," he said. "Mama said she did not think anyone would answer," the boy said. He had gone back to examining his rocks but was still clearly listening. "She told Aunt Cora it was silly to even send the letter, but she was sad when she said it." Levi did not know what to do with this information exactly, but it settled into him and stayed there. "What is your name?" he asked. "Samuel," the boy said. "What is yours again?" "Levi." "That is a good name," Samuel said with the generous finality of childhood. "You can go knock. She is making bread." Levi went to the door and knocked. He heard movement inside, and then the sound of someone setting something down, and then footsteps, and then the door opened. Ruby Wainwright was not what he had built in his imagination from her letter, but she was better. She was a woman of middle height with dark red hair pinned up in the practical way of women who have too much to do to spend time on arrangements, and brown eyes that were quick and sharp and a little guarded, and flour on her left hand from the bread she had been making, and an expression that went through surprise and then recognition, and then something more complicated in the space of about 3 seconds. "Mrs. Wainwright," Levi said. He took off his hat. "I am Levi Norris. I received your letter." Ruby stared at him. She had the particular stillness of a person trying to recalibrate everything they thought they knew about a situation. "You are from Colorado," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You rode from Colorado." "Mostly by train," he admitted. She looked at him for another moment, at his dark eyes and his road-dusty coat, and his hat held in both hands and the letter that she could see folded in his coat pocket, which was her letter, she realized, her letter that he had kept close enough to his chest that she could see the worn fold of it. Something moved across her face that she quickly steadied into composure. "You had better come inside," she said. "I need to finish the bread or it will not rise properly." He came inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled like yeast and wood smoke and something herbal, rosemary maybe, from the dried bundles hanging above the window. Ruby went back to her bread dough and resumed working it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who did not stop doing things just because something unexpected was happening, and Levi stood near the door for a moment before she pointed at a chair without looking at him, and he sat down. "You did not write back," she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. "No," he agreed. "I meant to. I sat down 3 times to write back, and each time I thought that what I needed to say was not the kind of thing that translates well to paper." She looked at him sideways. "And what did you need to say?" He turned his hat in his hands. He was a man who chose his words carefully and who did not offer them in large quantities, which meant that when he did speak, there was usually something in it. "That I read your letter 6 times," he said. That I started to read it a seventh time and did not finish it because something you wrote made me get up and saddle my horse instead. The bread dough took a particularly firm push from Ruby's hands. What did I write? She asked. The part about your children, he said. The one who collects rocks and the one who sings. She stopped working the dough. Not for long, but for a perceptible pause, the kind that happens when something unexpected catches you somewhere you did not know you were soft. Then she resumed. Samuel and Grace, she said. Yes. Why did that make you get up and saddle your horse, Mr. Norris? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Outside, through the window, he could see Samuel in the yard, still examining his rocks with that serious scientific attention. Because it was specific, he said finally. You did not describe them in any way that was meant to charm or persuade. You just told me who they were. And it occurred to me that a woman who writes about her children that way, without performing anything, is probably the same with everything else she says. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight and texture. Ruby stared at her bread dough for a long moment and then said, quietly, I did not send that letter expecting an answer. I want you to understand that. I sent it because my sister-in-law has more faith in the world than I have currently managed, and I did not want to argue with her anymore. I had all but stopped thinking about it. And now? He asked. She looked at him then fully, the way she had been carefully not doing since she opened the door. She looked at him the way you look at something when you are trying to decide if it is real. Now you are sitting in my kitchen, she said, and you are not what I expected because I expected nothing. What did you expect when you let yourself expect anything? He asked. The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but in the same family. Someone older, she said, or more dishonest looking, or both. I am 33, he said. I am 29, she said. I told you that in the letter. You did. And you still came. I did. She covered the bread dough with a cloth and turned to face him properly, wiping her hands on her apron. He stood up when she did, out of habit, which she noticed. A small thing, but she noticed it. I will make coffee, she said, and you are going to tell me about this ranch of yours, and I am going to tell you honestly what my situation is, and we are going to behave like sensible adults and not like people in a dime novel. That sounds exactly right, he said. She made the coffee. The kitchen filled with the rich, dark smell of it. Outside, a smaller voice joined Samuel's, a girl's voice, lilting and tuneless, and Levi glanced through the window to see a small girl with Ruby's red hair appear from around the corner of the barn and show Samuel something cupped in her hands, some treasure of the yard, and Samuel leaned in to look at it with his sister's same solemn interest. Grace, Levi said. Ruby at the stove said, she finds things. Feathers, stones, beetles, once a very small but living frog. She carries them around for a while and then sets them free or arranges them on the windowsill. A pause. I cannot make her stop, and I have stopped trying. Good, Levi said, and meant it so plainly that Ruby looked at him again with that measuring look. They sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and they talked. Not the careful performance of talking that people do when they are trying to make an impression, but the real kind, the kind that gets into corners. He told her about the ranch, its acreage, its current operation, the 3 hands he employed, the cattle and horses, the house that he had built himself over 2 summers with help from Art Dunbar, and was proud of in the particular way of a man who built something with his own hands and knew every board of it. He told her it had 3 bedrooms, which was more than he needed and which he had built anyway, as if he had been leaving space for something he had not yet arrived at. He told her about Art and Della Dunbar, who were his nearest neighbors, and about the town of Dusty Creek, which had 800 people and a schoolhouse and a doctor and a newspaper and a church of reasonable size, and which was rough in the way of western towns but not uncivilized. She listened to all of this and asked him direct questions about the winters, about the water, about what the children would do for schooling, about whether he was a man who drank heavily or gambled, about what he actually meant when he said honest intentions in the advertisement because those were easy words to print. He answered each question without deflecting, which she measured and found correct. He told her the winters in Colorado were harder than Tennessee winters, that the water situation was good, that the school in Dusty Creek ran 9 months of the year with a qualified teacher, that he drank moderately and did not gamble because he had seen enough men destroyed by it. He told her that by honest intentions he meant that he was not interested in an arrangement that was only convenient on his side, that he had been alone long enough to know what he wanted and to want it honestly rather than just expeditiously. Then she told him her situation. She told it without softening it, which he had somehow already known she would. The debt, the banknote due in the spring, the farm that she would likely lose because Thomas, God rest him, had borrowed against it without fully telling her how much, a thing she had not forgiven him for even after 14 months of trying. She told him that she had 2 children whose stability was her first and non-negotiable concern, that she was not a woman who would ship herself across the country for just any man, that she had standards that the last 14 months had not worn away but had in fact made more precise. She told him she was a hard worker and a good manager and not given to hysterics or to passivity, but that she was also a person who needed to be spoken to honestly and treated as having a mind worth consulting, and that if those things were going to be problems, she would rather know it now. Levi listened to all of it and said, "None of those things are problems." "Men often say that," Ruby said. "I know," he said. "I mean it." The afternoon light came through the kitchen windows at a low angle, the particular gold of October in Tennessee, and Levi became aware that he had been here several hours and that the conversation had not flagged once, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who conversed easily as a rule. He was a man who found most social exchange effortful and most people exhausting after extended exposure. Sitting in Ruby Wainwright's kitchen with his second cup of coffee, talking about water rights and children's schooling and personal integrity felt, improbably, like the least effortful thing he had done in years. A small knock came from the side door, the kind of knock that is performed by someone not very tall, and then Grace appeared in the doorway with dirt on her dress and something in her cupped hands and a look on her face that was absolutely certain she was going to be allowed to show it. She took in Levi with the swift, uncomplicated assessment of a 5-year-old and then looked at her mother. "Mama," she said, "I found a salamander." "I see that," Ruby said. "He is very nice," Grace said. "I am sure he is." Grace looked at Levi again. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. Levi looked at her solemnly. "I am a rancher," he said, "which is a kind of cowboy, yes." Grace considered this. "Do you have a horse?" "I have 8 horses," he said. Grace's eyes went wide. "Samuel," she shouted, pivoting in the doorway, "this man has 8 horses." Then she looked back at Levi with the serious focus of a person conducting an important negotiation. "Do any of them have spots?" "One of them is a paint," he said, "brown and white." "That is the same as spots," she said, with satisfaction. And then she went back outside to tell Samuel about the paint horse, the salamander apparently forgotten in the excitement. And Levi could hear her voice rising and falling in that singing way her mother had described in the letter. A voice that went through the world like it was putting music into it, whether music was called for or not. Ruby was watching her daughter through the window with an expression that she had not quite directed at Levi yet, an expression of full, unguarded love, the kind people show only when they think no one is watching. Then she seemed to recall that she was not alone and turned back and saw that he had been watching her with her daughter, and she did not look away or smooth the expression into something more neutral. She just let him see it, which was a kind of trust or the beginning of one. "They are everything I have," she said. "I know," he said, "and wherever I go they go." "I know that too," he said. "I would not have come if that was not the arrangement I wanted." She studied him. "Why?" she asked. "Why would a man who has built a ranch and seems to be managing well enough want to take on a widow and 2 children he has never met?" It was a fair question, and he took a moment with it. "Because managing well enough is not the same as living well," he said. "Because I built 3 bedrooms. Because your letter was the only honest thing I have read in a long time, and I find that I am very tired of things that are not honest." The afternoon was sliding into evening. From outside, Samuel's voice joined Grace's, and then they were arguing about something in the good-natured way of siblings who argue like they breathe, habitually and without real heat. The bread had risen and Ruby got up to put it in the oven, and the kitchen filled with that warm yeast and wood smoke smell, and Levi sat at the table with his empty coffee cup and felt, for the first time in a long while, like he was somewhere that could become a real place for him. He did not stay the night, of course. He found a room at the Millhaven boarding house, and he came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and then again for a fourth day. And during those 4 days things happened that changed the shape of the situation. He met Cora, the sister-in-law, who was a stout, energetic woman in her 40s who looked at him with the critical appraisal of a person who has been hoping for something and wants to make sure it is actually what it looks like. She asked him approximately 14 pointed questions in the first half hour of their meeting, and then told Ruby, in his presence and without apparent embarrassment, that she thought he would do. "Cora," Ruby said. "I am just saying what I see," Cora said. "I am not saying it is certain. I am saying it is possible." He met Art and Della Dunbar's names through his own letters. He had written to Art the day after he arrived in Millhaven, informing him of the situation, and Art had written back with the promptness of a man who had been waiting for this news and wanted to confirm it before it could change. Art's letter said simply, "I told you so, and Della says hello, and do not come back without her." He had shown the letter to Ruby, who had read it and then asked to read it again, as if measuring what it told her about the kind of people who would be her neighbors. On the third day, he helped repair the barn roof. He had noticed the damaged shingles on his first visit, and had not said anything until Ruby mentioned it herself, in the context of explaining why she needed to find a solution to her situation before winter. He showed up the next morning with new shingles from the Millhaven lumber yard, purchased with his own money before she could object, and Samuel came to stand below the ladder and watch him work with the concentrated attention of a 7-year-old who has not had a man around to watch in 14 months. "My papa used to fix things," Samuel said. "Good skill to have," Levi said. "Did your papa teach you?" "Some of it," Levi said, nailing a shingle into place. "Some of it I learned by getting it wrong first." Samuel considered this. "Did you get it wrong a lot?" "Enough to learn," Levi said. Samuel was quiet for a while, watching the shingles go down in their overlapping rows. Then he said, in the careful way of a child who has thought about something for a long time before saying it, "Are you going to marry my mother?" Levi paused with a nail between his fingers and looked down at the boy. Samuel had his mother's direct gaze and his own particular version of her composure, the composure of someone who has learned to take things as they come because the alternative is worse. He was 7 years old and had been the man of the house for 14 months, and he knew it and carried it without complaint, which was a lot of weight for a boy his age. "I do not know yet," Levi said honestly. "Your mother and I are still getting to know each other. That takes time." "She is very good," Samuel said. "She works hard. She does not complain even when things are bad." "I know," Levi said. "I can see that." "She was sad for a long time after Papa died," Samuel said. "She is less sad now, but she is still a little sad sometimes." Levi thought about what to say to that and settled on, "That is normal. People carry loss for a long time. Being a little sad sometimes does not mean things cannot also get better." Samuel seemed to find this acceptable. He watched a few more shingles go down and then said, "If you did marry her, would we have to call you Papa?" "I think that would be up to you," Levi said. "There is no rule about it." This also seemed acceptable. Samuel picked up a shingle from the pile on the ground and turned it over in his hands, examining it with the same attention he gave to his rocks. "It would be a long way to go," he said. "Colorado." "It is," Levi agreed. "What do you think about that?" Samuel thought seriously. "I would miss Aunt Cora," he said, "and my friend Tobias from school. But I would like to see the mountains." He set the shingle down. "Grace would like a horse," he added. "She would not stop talking about the spotted one." "The paint," Levi said. Yes, Samuel said, she has already named it. Levi laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polished social one, the kind that comes up unexpectedly and sounds like itself. What did she name it? Tuesday, Samuel said, with the long-suffering tone of an older sibling, because she said she thought of it on a Tuesday. I told her that was not a good horse name, but she did not listen. On the fourth day, Levi and Ruby walked out along the fence line of the farm in the late afternoon, because they had been inside for 3 days having conversations in kitchens, and he had some sense that people think more clearly outdoors, and that there were things they still needed to say to each other that had not quite found their way into the kitchen conversations. The air was cool and smelled like autumn leaves and wood smoke from neighboring chimneys, and their breath made small clouds, and Ruby had her coat pulled close and was walking with the purposeful stride of a woman who does not meander. "You are going to ask me to come to Colorado," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "And you are asking because you genuinely want me to come, not because it is convenient." "Yes." "How do you know the difference?" she asked. After 4 days, he was quiet for a moment. The fence line ran along the edge of a field where the last of the season's grass was brown and pressed down by an early frost. "Because I have been convenient before and it did not feel like this," he said. "Because I have sat at that table and talked to you for 4 days, and I have not once felt like I was managing the conversation, and I have not once wanted to be somewhere else. Because your children have gotten under my skin without apparently trying. Because when I got on the train in Pueblo, I thought I was probably being a fool, and now I do not think that." Ruby stopped walking. She turned to look at him, and the October light was on her face, and there was something in her expression that was not quite the guarded, measuring look she had been giving him since he arrived, something a little more open than that, and a little more afraid. "I am scared," she said. It cost her something to say it, he could tell. "Of what specifically?" he asked. "Of going and it being wrong," she said. "Of uprooting 2 children from everything they know and taking them to a place I have never seen and a house I have never been in, and it turning out to be wrong. Thomas was wrong in ways I did not see until they were done. I'm not good at seeing what people are until after." "You have been seeing me fairly clearly for 4 days," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it worse, because if I am reading you right, I want to go. And wanting something is terrifying when you have learned that things you want can go badly." He understood that completely. He had learned something similar, though by a different route, and he recognized the shape of it in her. "I cannot promise you that everything will be right," he said. "No one can promise that. But I can tell you that I have not said a single thing to you in 4 days that I did not mean, and that is a promise I can keep for the rest of my life if you will let me." The wind came through the dead grass along the fence, and Ruby's hair came loose at one side, and she tucked it back with the automatic gesture of a woman used to the wind, used to things needing to be steadied. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I need 2 more days, and I need to talk to Cora, and I need to talk to Samuel and Grace." "Take what you need," he said. "And I need you to understand that if I come as myself, not as a convenient arrangement, not as something that belongs to the ranch. That is the only way I want you to come," he said. "All right," she said, and then quietly, almost to herself, "All right," Cora cried when Ruby told her she was going. She cried the way practical women cry, thoroughly and without much apology, and then she stopped and blew her nose and told Ruby she was doing the right thing and that she looked happy, or at least like someone who remembered what happy felt like, which was close enough. She made Ruby promise to write every week. She gave Samuel her best biscuit recipe copied out on a card, because she said he ought to have something of hers to take to Colorado. She put both arms around Grace and held her for a long time and did not say anything, and Grace patted her back with the gentle, focused attention of a child who understands more than she seems to. Ruby sold what she could from the farm, paid what she could against Thomas's debts, and arranged with the bank to take the remaining balance from the sale of the property itself. It cleared just barely, with almost nothing left over, which was a kind of relief and a kind of grief at the same time. The place Thomas had borrowed against was gone, but so was the debt, and the thing that had been pressing on her chest like a stone for 14 months lifted when the papers were signed, and she stood outside the bank in the November air and breathed differently than she had in over a year. Levi had arranged everything for the journey west. He was a thorough man, not in a fussy way, but in the way of someone who has learned that the difference between things going smoothly and things going badly is usually preparation. He had tickets for the train from Nashville to Pueblo, with a stop in St. Louis where they would change trains, and he had made sure there was a private car compartment so that Grace could sleep lying down because she was 5, and 5-year-olds did not sleep well sitting up. He had written ahead to Art and Della Dunbar to let them know they were coming, and Della had written back immediately with a letter that was addressed directly to Ruby, which Ruby had read and then read to Levi with a slight tightness around her eyes that was her version of being moved. Della's letter said, "I know you are brave to be doing this. I did the same thing 7 years ago and I have not regretted one single day. The country is hard and beautiful and it will take some getting used to, and Levi is a good man, one of the best I have known, which is not a thing I say about many people. Come and we will be friends. I have been waiting for someone worth being friends with for 3 years. The train journey west was 5 days, counting the layover in St. Louis. It was the longest sustained distance Ruby had ever traveled, and the landscape that rolled past the windows changed so gradually, and then so dramatically that it was almost disorienting. The soft green hills giving way to the broader, browner stretches of Missouri and Kansas. The sky getting bigger in a way that she could not quite explain to herself, until she looked out the window one morning and realized that the horizon was just simply farther away than it had ever been in Tennessee. That the land was flatter and the sky more complete, and that it made her feel both very small and very free, which was an unusual combination. Samuel kept a small notebook in which he recorded observations, which Ruby had bought him at the St. Louis station, and which he took to immediately, sitting with it on his knee and writing things down with the solemn concentration of a naturalist. He wrote, "Large birds, not like Tennessee birds, much bigger. Flat land for many miles. Man in the car behind ours has a very large hat. The train smells like coal and also like someone's lunch, which I think is beans." Grace slept and sang, and found a caterpillar somewhere on the train that no one could explain the origin of, and named it Henry, and kept it in a paper cup, until Levi gently suggested that Henry would probably be happier outside, and she considered this with genuine philosophical care, and then agreed and set Henry free at the next station stop. Levi sat across from Ruby for most of the journey, and they talked when the children were asleep, and were comfortably quiet when they were not. He showed her the country on a fold-out map he had brought, tracing the route with his finger, showing her where Dusty Creek sat in the crease of the Colorado foothills, showing her the ranch's approximate position relative to the town. She asked him questions about the growing season, about the nearest doctor, about what the social life of Dusty Creek was like. He answered everything she asked. She liked that he did not add things she had not asked. He was precise in a way that suited her. On the 3rd evening of the journey, when the children were both asleep in the compartment, and the train was moving through the dark Kansas flatlands with a rhythmic rocking that was almost like the sea, Ruby and Levi sat on opposite sides of the compartment's small table, with the lamp turned low between them and the dark prairie moving past the window, and the conversation went quiet in a way that was different from their other quiet moments, more charged, more aware of itself. "You are nervous," he said. He had noticed. "I am always nervous," she said. "I have just learned to look calm." "What are you nervous about right now specifically?" She looked at the lamp flame. "That I am doing the right thing," she said. "That I will be good at it, that the children will be happy." That she stopped. "That," he prompted. She looked at him. "That you will not be disappointed," she said. "When the novelty of this wears off and I am just an ordinary person with her ordinary difficulties, that you will not find that you preferred the idea of me to the reality." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the dark prairie went on in all directions, immense and indifferent and oddly comforting for being so. "I have been thinking about this since your letter," he said. "Not about the idea of you. About you specifically, what you wrote, how you wrote it. I did not fall in admiration of a concept. You are a precise person. Your letter was precise. You told me who you were without decoration, and I responded to who you were. The ordinary difficulties you are worried about are not going to surprise me." "Everyone has limits," she said. "They do," he agreed. "But I went looking for someone to share a life with, not someone to perform one with. Those are different things, and the ordinary is what a shared life is mostly made of." She was quiet after that. Not unhappy quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after something has been said that needed saying. On the last night before they reached Pueblo, when the children were asleep, and the compartment was dark except for the thin, pale light from the window and the occasional orange flash of the engine's fire against the passing dark, Ruby reached across the small table and put her hand over his. Just briefly. Just the weight of it, the warmth of it. He turned his hand over so his palm was up, and her fingers rested in it for a moment, and neither of them said anything at all. Dusty Creek in November was cold and clear and smelled like pine and dried grass and horses, and the mountains were visible from the main street, the front range rising to the west in a wall of white-capped stone that made Ruby stop on the station platform with her bags at her feet and just look, because she had never seen anything like it. Samuel appeared at her elbow and looked at the mountains with the same expression, and then Grace appeared on the other side and said, in a very small, reverent voice, "Oh." "Yes," Ruby said. "Art and Della Dunbar met them at the station." Art was a broad, cheerful man with a red beard, and a handshake that he applied to everyone including Grace, who shook his hand with great seriousness. Della was slim and capable-looking with gray eyes and a direct manner that immediately communicated to Ruby that she was a woman of substance, and she put both hands on Ruby's arms in a greeting that was more than a handshake but not quite an embrace, the greeting of a woman measuring whether this was the friendship she had been waiting for, and apparently deciding yes because she smiled with her whole face and said, "I am so glad you are here. Come on, we will get you settled." The ranch was 4 miles from town. The road out to it was rough, but the air was incredible, sharp and clean and enormous. And Ruby sat in the wagon next to Levi, while Art drove and Della sat in the back with the children telling them about the local wildlife. And the mountains moved past on the western horizon like they were keeping pace. And Ruby looked at the land and tried to understand it, tried to read it the way she read things, trying to find what it was saying about what kind of place it was. The house was bigger than she had expected. 2 stories, solidly built, with a covered porch that ran across the front and a kitchen that was genuinely spacious by any standard she had known. It had 3 bedrooms, as he had said, 1 large one and 2 smaller ones, and a parlor with a stone fireplace that Levi lit as soon as they arrived, and the smell of the pine fire and the wood smoke was familiar enough to feel like something she had always known. Samuel walked through the whole house examining everything with his notebook. Grace went directly to the window that looked out toward the barn and announced that she could see the horses from here. "Which one is Tuesday?" she asked. "The one closest to the fence," Levi said, appearing behind her and pointing. "The brown and white one." Grace pressed her nose to the glass. The paint horse stood in the late afternoon light with the particular noble patience of horses that know they are being admired. "Hello, Tuesday," Grace said. Ruby stood in the kitchen with her coat still on, looking at the stove and the shelves and the window that looked out over the kitchen garden, bare now in November but clearly tended, clearly the kind of ground that would yield something in spring, and felt the thing that she had been afraid to feel for 14 months. The thing that grief and debt and surviving had pushed down so thoroughly that she had begun to wonder if it was still there. Hope. A specific, rooted, directed hope. Not the floating, impractical kind, not the desperate reaching kind, but the kind that looks around a place and sees what it could become. She heard Levi come into the kitchen behind her, and she turned, and she was standing in the kitchen of his house with her coat still buttoned and flour probably still somewhere on her from the last batch of bread she had made in Tennessee before they left. And he looked at her with those dark, still eyes and that expression of careful attention that she had been watching for 2 weeks now, and that she had decided was the most honest face she had ever seen on a man. "It needs some things," he said. "Things I did not know to get. But whatever it needs, we can get it." "It is good," she said. "It is genuinely good, Levi." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding since they pulled up in the wagon, the breath of a man who had been waiting to hear what she thought and who had not wanted to show how much it mattered. "Good," he said. The first weeks in Dusty Creek were a kind of sustained discovery. Ruby was not a woman who needed to be eased into things. She went at the ranch with the same efficient energy she had applied to surviving in Tennessee, but with a different quality to it, a forward quality instead of a maintaining one, as if she were building rather than holding. She reorganized the kitchen within the first 3 days, which Levi observed without comment, and with what appeared to be genuine approval, moving things from where they had been kept for convenience to where they made sense given how she cooked. She found the kitchen garden in its winter state and spent 2 afternoons planning what she would plant in spring, making notes in the margin of Samuel's observation notebook, because she had not brought one of her own, and Samuel gave her several pages with the gracious generosity of a 7-year-old sharing what he has. The children settled faster than Ruby had expected. Samuel was enrolled in the Dusty Creek School within the first week, where he found a friend immediately. A boy named Marcus whose father ran the feed store, and who also kept a notebook of observations, and who recognized Samuel's notebooks on the first day as the badge of a fellow scientific mind. Grace was too young for school, but Della Dunbar came 3 mornings a week and spent time with both women, and Grace attached herself to Della's side with the comfortable confidence of a child who decides she likes someone and sees no reason to conceal it. Levi watched all of this. He was a man who watched things, who took things in carefully before he spoke about them, and what he watched over those first weeks was Ruby moving through his house and making it something it had not been before, not changing it exactly, but bringing it into focus somehow, the way you bring a lamp to a room that has been getting along in the dark. He watched her at the dinner table, explaining something to Grace with the patient specificity that she brought to everything. He watched her at the porch railing in the cold evenings, looking at the mountains with the expression of a person who is still not entirely sure they are real. He watched her in the kitchen, working with the focused pleasure of a woman who is good at something and knows it. He was falling in love with her, and he knew it the way you know a season is changing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in 1,000 small accumulating signs until one day the fact of it is simply obvious and you cannot quite remember the moment it started. He told Art Dunbar, because Art was the kind of man you could tell things to without it becoming complicated. They were mending fence on the boundary between their 2 properties, working in the cold December air with their breath-making clouds, and Levi said it without preamble because there was no way to say it with preamble. "I am in love with her," he said. Art stopped mending fence and looked at him with the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to confirm something he already knew. "Yes," Art said. "I have not said anything to her." "Why not?" Levi thought about it. "Because she came out here with a great deal of uncertainty, and I do not want her to feel that I am adding pressure to something she is still finding her footing in," he said. "She needs time to know what she wants without me making it complicated." Art resumed mending fence. "That is thoughtful," he said, "and also possibly unnecessary based on what Della says." Levi looked at him. "What does Della say?" Art had the expression of a man who has already said more than his wife probably wanted him to. "I am not going to repeat it," he said. "But I will say that 2 sensible people who are clearly falling in love and who are not saying so because they do not want to pressure the other one are in a position that can only be resolved by one of them saying something first. That is not a great deal of help, Art." "No," Art agreed. but it is honest. The conversation with Ruby happened on a Sunday evening in December when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and the fire in the parlor was banked low, casting just enough warmth and light to make the room feel like itself. Ruby had been writing to Cora. She wrote every week, as promised, and she finished the letter and folded it and set it on the table to mail in the morning. And then she sat in the chair by the fire and looked into the coals with the particular expression of someone whose mind is not quite empty. Levi came in from checking on the horses. It was a cold night and he had wanted to be sure the barn was tight, and he saw her there and sat down in the chair across from her, not the chair he usually took, the one a bit farther from the fire but the closer one, and she looked up when he sat. "Ruby," he said. "Yes," she said, just that, like she had been waiting for him to say her name. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I want to be clear that I am not telling you because I expect something in return or because I want to change what you are doing, because what you are doing seems good and I do not want to complicate it. But I need to say it because," he stopped. "Because," she said, "because I am not very good at carrying things that want to be said," he told her. "I have learned that silence is sometimes the honest choice and sometimes it is just the cowardly one, and I do not want to be cowardly about this." Ruby had gone very still, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on him, and the firelight was making shadows move on her face. "I love you," he said. It came out very simply, no decoration, no performance, just the fact of it. "I do not know exactly when it happened. Possibly when you made coffee and told me we were going to behave like sensible adults. Possibly before that. But it is true and it is not going to stop being true, and I think you should know it." Ruby did not say anything for a moment. The fire settled in the grate, a small shift of coals. Outside, the wind came against the house in the way of Colorado wind, which is not the same as Tennessee wind, which Levi had explained to her on her first week, and which she had come to recognize steadier, more purposeful, as if it is going somewhere. "Levi," she said. And then she said, "I have been scared to say this because the last time I trusted someone fully, it did not protect me from pain, and I built myself a very careful system of being guarded after that, which felt like wisdom for a long time." She paused. "It stopped feeling like wisdom somewhere around the third day you were in Millhaven." He waited. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some weeks. I have been living in your house and watching you with my children who trust people about as carefully as I do, and both of them trust you, and that tells me something. Grace named a horse after a day of the week because you told her about it. Samuel has been asking you questions about ranch management in his scientific notebook. These are not things that happen with people they do not feel safe with." "I know," he said, "and I feel safe with you," she said, "which is the thing that matters most. Not the excitement of it, though that is real too, but the safety. I had forgotten what that felt like." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the firelight with their hands linked, and the wind at the windows and the children asleep upstairs and the ranch quiet outside, and it was not a dramatic moment in any theatrical sense, but it was the kind of moment that makes a life. He asked her to marry him in the first week of January, 1883, not with elaborate ceremony but with the plain directness that was his way. Sitting at breakfast with snow coming down outside and the children not yet awake, he said, "I would like to marry you if you want to." And she said, "Yes, I do want to," and he reached across the table and touched her face with one hand just briefly, the way you touch something you are grateful for, and she covered his hand with hers. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter was past, and the first real light of spring was beginning to soften the edges of the brown hills. The wedding was a simple one in the Dusty Creek Church, a building of white-painted wood that was modest and genuine, with Art Dunbar standing as witness and Della Dunbar standing as Ruby's matron of honor, and Eli and the other ranch hands filling half the pews, and Marcus and his family taking up a row because Samuel had invited him with the grave formality of a boy extending an important invitation. There was a reception at the Dunbar Ranch afterward, where Della had organized things with the efficiency of a woman who had strong opinions about celebrations and the energy to act on them. And there was a fiddle player from town, and a spread of food that covered 2 long tables, and Cora had sent a letter that arrived 2 days before the wedding, and that Ruby had read at the kitchen table with her hand over her mouth. Cora's letter said, "Ruby, I am sitting here in Millhaven being very proud of you. You were always braver than you thought you were. I hope he is everything that letter promised, and from what you write I think he probably is. Give my love to Samuel and Grace, and tell that man of yours that if he ever disappoints you I will make the journey west personally. All my love, Cora." Samuel and Grace were at the wedding in their best clothes, which Della had helped press the evening before, and Grace had a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had found in the church storeroom and claimed as her personal contribution to the occasion, and Samuel had his observation notebook, but kept it in his pocket out of respect for the seriousness of the event. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Levi kissed Ruby, which he did with the same plainness and sincerity that characterized everything he did, Samuel looked at Grace and Grace looked at Samuel, and Grace said quietly, "Now he lives here forever." And Samuel said, just as quietly, "He already did." And they both turned back to watch their mother and Levi with expressions of solemn satisfaction. That first year of marriage was the year that Ruby understood what it meant to build rather than survive. It was not without difficulty. The ranch had its demands, the Colorado winter had its cruelty, and there was the sustained work of learning to share a space and a life with someone. All the small negotiations of habit and preference and privacy that go into making a home from 2 separate histories. But the difficulty was the good kind, the kind that comes from working towards something rather than against it. And she and Levi had the particular advantage of 2 people who had agreed from the beginning to be honest with each other, which meant that when things needed to be said they generally got said, which meant that things did not accumulate into distance. She planted the kitchen garden in May, and it yielded better than she had hoped, the Colorado soil being richer than she had expected, and she put up preserves that summer in quantities that filled 2 shelves of the cellar, and Levi tasted the first jar of peach preserves that came out of the water bath and said it was the best thing he had eaten, which was not true because she had been cooking for him for months, and she knew he was capable of more accurate praise. And so she said so, and he laughed and said all right. It was the best thing he had eaten all week at minimum. Samuel, in his 2nd year at the Dusty Creek School, had a teacher named Miss Pearson who recognized immediately that he was a child of exceptional curiosity, and who fed it rather than containing it, giving him extra books and extra problems, and the general sense that his way of moving through the world was an asset rather than a disturbance. He came home from school one afternoon in October, carrying a rock specimen that Miss Pearson had given him from her own collection, and talking about geology with a speed and density that required full attention to follow. And Ruby sat at the kitchen table and listened to him for 20 minutes without interrupting, because his face was lit up in a way that made everything else secondary. Grace began school the following autumn, and took to it with the same wholehearted engagement she brought to everything, making 3 best friends in the first week and a 4th by the end of the month, and covering everything with the characteristic Grace quality of enthusiastic noise. She also, as had been predicted by no one but seemed in retrospect inevitable, developed a complete and passionate expertise in horses. She could name every horse on the ranch by temperament as well as name, could tell you which ones needed a firm hand and which ones needed patience, and spent her Saturday mornings with Eli learning the daily routines of the barn, with the focused joy of someone who has found their thing. Tuesday the paint horse was Grace's. This was not formally decided so much as recognized by everyone on the ranch as simply true, the way some facts are not decided but arrive. Ruby was expecting their first child by the end of the first summer of their marriage, which she told Levi on a September evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the last of the light go off the mountains. She told him directly, the way she told him everything, and watched his face. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her, and she could see in his face something that did not usually show so plainly, a full, unguarded, overwhelming gladness. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they sat on the porch until the mountains went dark and the stars came out over the Colorado sky, which were more stars than she had ever seen in Tennessee, stars that went from horizon to horizon without interruption. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said. And because she was Ruby Wainwright, who did not say things she did not mean, he knew it was true. The baby came in May of 1884, a boy, strong and loud and dark-haired like Levi, who arrived in the world with strong opinions about it and the vocal range to communicate them. They named him James after Levi's father and David for Ruby's grandfather, and he was James David Norris from the first minute. And by the end of the first week, Samuel was referring to him as Jimmy, which stuck. Grace held him with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who understands they are handling something important and said, with absolute conviction, "He looks like a bean." And Levi, standing at her elbow, agreed that yes, he somewhat did. Levi held his son in the first hour of his life and stood at the window of the bedroom with the light coming in from the May morning and the mountains beyond the window doing what the mountains always did, which was be there, unmoved and enormous and reassuring in their permanence, and felt something close out in him, some space that had been open since before he could name it, some waiting quality in himself that was finally, completely done waiting. Ruby, watching him from the bed with the particular observational sharpness that she maintained even while being exhausted from childbirth, said, "You look like you have been waiting for that for a very long time." "I have," he said. "Then it is good that you rode before you finished reading the 7th time," she said. He looked at her. She was pale and tired, and her hair was coming down, and she was smiling the smile she reserved for things that actually made her happy, the real one, not the composed social one. He came back to the bed and sat on the edge of it and handed Jimmy carefully back to her and leaned in and kissed her forehead, and she put her free hand on his face. "Yes," he said, "it is very good." In the summer of 1884, Dusty Creek changed somewhat, as western towns in Colorado were changing. A second bank opened, which indicated prosperity, and a new hotel went up on the main street, and the school got an additional room to accommodate the growing number of children. The territory was filling in, the rough edges being worn down by the simple accumulation of people making lives in it. Levi watched this with the satisfaction of a man who had been here when the roughness was sharper and who could see the shape of what it was becoming. There were still things that were hard. The ranch had a difficult spring in 1885 when a late blizzard killed 12 of their cattle, and the loss was not catastrophic, but it was significant, and Levi spent 3 days working through the numbers at the kitchen table with Ruby, who sat across from him, and went through the figures with him with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything. They came out the other side of the numbers with a plan that was tight but workable, and Ruby made coffee and set it between them and said, "We will be all right," and he believed her because she had never said it when she did not mean it. It was also the summer of 1885 that Eli came to Levi with the nervous but determined look of a young man who has made a decision. Eli was 23 now, still wiry, still from Texas, still the best natural horseman on the ranch, and he wanted to ask Levi's advice about whether he thought a man in Eli's position could reasonably save enough in 5 years to consider his own piece of land. Levi thought about it and told Eli that yes, he thought it was possible, and that he would help him think through the economics of it if Eli wanted, and Eli said he would want that. And they spent an afternoon talking through what land cost and what cattle cost and what the realistic earnings of a working ranch hand were. And at the end of it, Eli looked like someone who had been handed something he had not quite expected to receive. He also mentioned, somewhat obliquely, that there was a girl in Dusty Creek, a young woman of 20 named Clara whose father ran the feed store, Marcus's sister, and that he had been thinking about her a good deal. Ruby, who was passing through the room when this last part was mentioned, stopped and said, "Clara is a lovely person," and Eli turned red to the ears, and Ruby went on her way with the composed dignity of a woman who knows when not to say more. Clara and Eli were married 2 years later in 1887 in the same Dusty Creek church where Levi and Ruby had married, and Ruby stood with Della Dunbar in the third row and watched Clara come down the aisle toward Eli, who looked like a man who could not believe what he was seeing, and Ruby leaned slightly toward Della and said quietly, "That expression," and Della said, equally quietly, "I know." Mine was the same, and Ruby thought about Levi's face the morning of their wedding and felt the warmth of it all the way through. By the autumn of 1887, the Norris Ranch was 8 years established as Levi's operation and nearly 4 years established as theirs together, and it was a different place than it had been when Ruby arrived. Not because anything structural had changed, though there were improvements: a new section of fence, a proper cellar properly stocked, the kitchen garden expanded to 3 times its original size because Ruby's ambition had outpaced the original plot. The difference was in the quality of presence the place had, the lived-in quality that a house gets when it is genuinely inhabited and not just occupied. There were boots in 4 different sizes on the porch. There were drawings of horses covering the lower section of Grace's bedroom wall. There were rocks arranged in careful taxonomic order on Samuel's windowsill. There was a rocking horse in the parlor that had been carved by Art Dunbar as a birthday gift for Jimmy, who was 3 and ferociously energetic, and who treated the rocking horse with the passionate devotion of a small cowboy, which everyone found extremely funny. Ruby found out she was expecting again in the winter of 1887, which she told Levi at breakfast in the same way she had told him 3 years before, directly and while watching his face. His face did the same thing it had done 3 years before, that full, unguarded gladness. He reached across the table for her hand and held it, and Jimmy, who was present and alert as always, said, "What?" And Levi said, "You are going to have a brother or sister," and Jimmy thought about this and said, "Which one?" And Ruby said, "We will find out," and Jimmy said, "I want a brother because Samuel is mostly too old," which made Samuel, at 12 and practicing dignity, look profoundly affronted. The baby came in July of 1888, in the hottest part of a Colorado summer, during a week when the air was so dry and warm that Ruby said it felt like breathing in a bread oven, which Levi agreed with and could do nothing about. The baby was a girl with Ruby's red hair, which appeared with astonishing completeness for a newborn, and Levi's dark eyes, and an expression from the first moments of life that was already identifiably determined. They named her Margaret, after Ruby's mother, and called her Maggie from the start. "She already has opinions," Grace said, examining her new sister with the expert assessment of someone who had spent 3 years around Jimmy. "All the Norris women have opinions," Ruby said. "You are a Norris woman," Grace said. "I am," Ruby agreed. "What do you think that tells you?" Grace grinned, which was a Grace grin, wide and uncontained and very much its own thing. "That Maggie is going to be a lot," Grace said. "She is going to be wonderful," Ruby said. Cora came to visit that August, making the journey west by train with the determined energy of a woman who has been meaning to do something for a long time and has finally stopped letting other things get in the way. She arrived at the Dusty Creek station with 2 large bags and a box of molasses cookies that she had baked specifically for the journey and that had survived it remarkably intact, and she stood on the platform and looked at the mountains for a long moment before anyone spoke. "Good Lord," she said. "Yes," Ruby agreed. "You could have told me." "I tried," Ruby said. Cora turned from the mountains and looked at Ruby, who was standing in the August Colorado sun with Maggie on her hip and Jimmy holding her other hand and Grace beside her, and Levi behind her with his hand on her shoulder. And the particular look on Ruby's face that Cora had last seen there 14 years ago when Ruby was young and before Thomas and before all the grief of it. The look of someone who is all right, who is better than all right, who has found the place where they belong. Cora pressed her hand to her mouth and then she said, in a voice that was doing its level best to be steady, "You look happy, Ruby." "I am," Ruby said. Cora hugged her, and then she hugged Levi, which surprised him into a stillness that made Ruby smile. And then she hugged Samuel, who was 12 and trying to look too old for hugging and failing entirely, and Grace, who had been waiting patiently and hugged back with both arms completely committed, and Jimmy, who submitted to being hugged with the loud tolerance of a 3-year-old who has things to do. Then Cora took Maggie from Ruby's hip and looked at her with the face of a woman who is constitutionally incapable of not loving a baby and said, "Hello, Margaret. I am your Aunt Cora. I am going to teach you everything important." "She is 5 weeks old," Ruby said. "Never too early," Cora said. Cora stayed for 3 weeks, which was the longest visit of anyone who had ever come to the ranch. And in those 3 weeks she and Della Dunbar became friends with the speed and certainty of 2 women who recognized their own kind. And she helped in the kitchen. And she taught Jimmy a song that he then sang at full volume for the next 6 months. And she sat on the porch with Ruby in the evenings when the children were in bed, and they talked the way they used to talk when Ruby was young and the world had not gotten complicated yet. One evening Cora said, "I was right about the advertisement." "You were right about the advertisement," Ruby agreed. "I am usually right," Cora said. "People do not listen to me nearly enough." "You were right," Ruby said again, "and I am glad. I am deeply, genuinely glad." Cora looked out at the mountains going dark in the evening light. "I know," she said. "I can see that." When Cora left, Ruby stood at the station and hugged her for a long time and then stood on the platform and watched the train until it was out of sight, and then she stood there a moment longer, just breathing. Levi came to stand beside her and did not say anything, just was there, which was what she needed. "She will come back," he said after a while. "I know," Ruby said, "and I will write her every week." "I know," he said. She turned from the tracks and looked at him, her husband of 5 years, this man who had ridden before he finished reading a letter for the 7th time and who had not, in all the years since, given her a single reason to regret that she had been waiting for him on the other side of it. "I should have written that letter sooner," she said. "You wrote it exactly when you needed to," he said. "You read it 6 times," she said. "I would have read it 60, he said. She took his arm and they walked back to the wagon where the children were arguing about who got to sit where. Grace claiming the left side because she always had the left side, and Jimmy claiming the left side because he did not know about any such rule, and Samuel refereeing with the weary competence of a 12-year-old who has been doing this since his sister was born and has mostly made his peace with it. Levi got up to the wagon seat and reached down and took Jimmy bodily and set him on the right side and said, "Grace gets the left." And Jimmy opened his mouth to protest and then closed it because Levi's word was a reliable thing and Jimmy had already learned that arguing with it was not productive. "Is it always going to be like this?" Ruby asked, climbing up to the wagon seat beside Levi. "Worse when Maggie gets old enough to have opinions," he said. "Perfect," she said and meant it. They drove home through the October afternoon, under the enormous Colorado sky, past the fence lines and the dry grass and the mountains that were always there, enormous and permanent and full of the kind of beauty that does not ask you to respond to it but rewards you if you do. And the children's voices rose and fell in the wagon behind them, and Ruby had her hand through Levi's arm and her face tipped up to the last warmth of the autumn sun. The years that came after had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because no real life is, but good in the sustained fundamental way that matters more than any particular drama. Samuel grew into a young man of serious and genuine intelligence, who decided by the time he was 15 that he wanted to study natural science, a declaration that Ruby received with the mixture of pride and practicality that was her way with everything, asking him immediately what that would require in practical terms, and then sitting down with Levi to think through how to make it possible. Levi believed in Samuel's mind the way he believed in good land, with the quiet certainty of someone who recognizes value without needing to be told about it. By the time Samuel was 19, there was a plan that was tight but real, involving a letter to a school in Denver and savings, and the kind of careful persistence that the Norris family had in common as a trait. Grace grew into the horse she had always been becoming, fearless and particular, and possessed of a patience with animals that contrasted so completely with her native loudness with people that it was like watching two different beings. By the time she was 15, she was managing the training of the ranch's young horses with a skill that made even Eli defer to her judgment, which was a thing Eli did not do easily, and which therefore meant a great deal. She was also, by 16, receiving attention from several young men in Dusty Creek, which Levi noticed and thought about more than he showed, and Ruby noticed him noticing and told him to take it slowly, that Grace was sensible and would make her own choices, and that the best thing they could do was make sure she knew she could tell them anything. Grace made her own choices. She was 17 when she told her parents she intended to marry a young man named Peter Calloway, who was 20 and who farmed with his father north of Dusty Creek, and who had the particular quality of someone who genuinely sees the person they are with rather than the person they would prefer them to be. Levi thought about it and talked to Peter and told Grace yes, he thought Peter was all right, and Grace said she had not been asking permission, and Levi said he knew that. He was giving his opinion since she had mentioned it, and Grace looked at him for a moment and then laughed and hugged him, which was a Grace hug full commitment, no reservation. "You are impossible to argue with," she said. "You have been trying since you were 5, he said. "You were right about Tuesday being a good horse name. You are right about Peter." She pulled back and looked at him with her mother's eyes in her father's direction, the way she had always looked at him, with a kind of recognition. "You are my father," she said. "You know that, right? Not the word, the thing itself." He had to hold that for a moment before he could respond. "Yes," he said, "I know." Jimmy at 12 was a solid, cheerful boy who approached the ranch with the practical enthusiasm of someone born to it, following Levi and Eli with equal devotion and acquiring skills with the uncomplicated pleasure of a child who loves what he loves without needing to justify it. He was not Samuel's kind of academic, but he was intelligent in the applied way, the kind that looks at a problem and sees what needs to be done rather than what it represents theoretically. And by the time he was 12, he was doing real work on the ranch, not make work, and taking it seriously. Maggie at 4 was a phenomenon. Cora, in her letters, had been asking for detailed reports since Maggie's birth and had been receiving them with apparent delight. Maggie had her mother's red hair and her father's dark eyes, and what appeared to be the combined personality traits of both her parents, and both her older siblings concentrated into one small, ferocious person. She had opinions about everything and stated them with Ruby's directness and Levi's emphasis. She had already shown an interest in the kitchen garden that pleased Ruby deeply. She also already showed a capacity for stubborn stillness that reminded Levi powerfully of himself, the ability to simply wait something out with absolute patience, which on a 4-year-old was both admirable and occasionally alarming. The winter of 1892, when Ruby was 39 and Levi was 43, and the ranch had been theirs together for nearly a decade, was a cold one, the kind of Colorado winter that tests everything. The ranch came through it. Not easily, and with some losses in the cattle that required a hard spring of rebuilding, but through it, because they went into it prepared and worked it together, and came out the other side tired but unbroken, which was the shape of survival when survival is chosen rather than merely endured. In the spring of 1893, Samuel left for Denver and the school there, with his collection of rocks in a case that Ruby had had specially made, and his observation notebooks, which by now ran to 14 volumes, and the quiet, fierce hope of a young man going toward his particular thing. Ruby stood at the Dusty Creek station and did not cry until the train had gone, and then cried in a thorough, practical way and stopped. And Levi stood beside her and held her hand, and did not say that Samuel would be all right, because they both already knew it, and saying it would have been a kind of performance that neither of them needed. They stood on the station platform until the tracks were empty and the sky over the mountains was the particular blue of a Colorado spring, and then Ruby said, "He is going to do something remarkable." "Yes," Levi said, "and we have to let him." "Yes," Levi said, "even though it is very hard." "Yes," Levi said. She turned to look at him. "You always agree with me," she said. "When you are right," he said. "Am I always right?" "Not always," he said, "but more than most people." She laughed. He had been making her laugh for 10 years, and he still did it the same way he had always done it, without trying, without performance, with the straightforward delivery of a man who says what he means and lets it land where it lands. Grace married Peter Calloway in the summer of 1893, in the same church, with the same fiddle player from Dusty Creek who had played at Levi and Ruby's wedding, who was now considerably older but still playing and still good. Grace was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress, though Della Dunbar and Ruby had spent an afternoon in Dusty Creek selecting fabric for it with the focused pleasure of women who know what they are doing and enjoy the doing of it. Grace was radiant because she was Grace and she was happy, and Grace happy was simply a fact that illuminated everything around it. Jimmy held Maggie's hand at the reception and let her eat too much cake, which she was going to do regardless, and they both knew it. And at one point, Maggie climbed up onto Levi's lap and leaned back against his chest and watched the dancing with the serious satisfaction of a 5-year-old who has decided the world is interesting. And Levi's arms came around her, and he rested his chin on the top of her red head. And Ruby, across the room talking to Della, saw this and went very quiet for a moment, watching her husband hold their youngest, and felt the full weight of the life she had built in a way that sometimes surprised her even still. Della came to stand beside her, following her gaze, and they watched together. "You look like that sometimes," Della said, "like you are still surprised." "I am," Ruby said. "I think that is a good thing." "It is," Della said. "It means you know what you have." Later that evening, when the dancing was at its height and the fiddle was going and Grace and Peter were spinning in the center of the floor, Levi appeared at Ruby's elbow and put his hand at her back and said, "Dance with me." She turned and looked at him. "You do not like dancing," she said. "I like dancing with you," he said, which was true and which she knew. She took his hand and they went to the floor, and they danced in the way of two people who have been doing this long enough to know each other's weight and rhythm, who have adjusted to each other over years, until the adjustment is so complete that it feels like instinct. The fiddle played something that was not quite a waltz but moved like one, and Grace spun by in Peter's arms with her face lit up, and Jimmy was attempting to teach Maggie to dance in the corner with very mixed results, and Art Dunbar was dancing with Della with the easy competence of a man who has had many years of practice, and the whole room was full of the particular warmth of people who are celebrating a thing that is genuinely worth celebrating. Ruby looked up at Levi. "We have had a good life," she said. "We are having a good life," he corrected gently. "Present tense." She held him a little closer. "Present tense," she agreed. There was a letter on the kitchen table when they got home from the wedding, which had been forwarded from the Denver school. A letter from Samuel, written 2 weeks ago, saying that he had passed his first-year examinations and that his professor had told him he had an exceptional mind for the field and that there might be an opportunity to contribute to a geological survey of the Colorado mountain range the following summer, and that he was writing to tell them first, before anyone else, because they should know first. Ruby read the letter at the kitchen table at midnight, still in her wedding clothes, with Maggie asleep on the settle and Jimmy having made it as far as the parlor floor before he fell asleep, and Levi standing at her shoulder reading it with her, and at the end of it she set it down on the table and said, "There it is." "There it is," Levi agreed. She turned in her chair to face him. He was 44 years old, and the years of the ranch were in him, in his hands and in the weathering around his eyes. And he was still the man who had ridden from Colorado on the strength of a letter he had read 6 times and could not stop reading, who had shown up at her door with road dust on his coat and her letter in his pocket, who had fixed her barn roof and talked to her son about rocks and told her daughter the name of a paint horse, who had said "I love you" in a parlor firelight without decoration or performance and had meant it every day since. "I sent that letter not expecting anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "You were," he agreed, which was the closest thing to "I told you so" that Levi Norris had ever said in his life. And he said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been right about something important and had had the good sense not to be smug about it until a decade later, when being smug about it was almost entirely acceptable. She stood up and he took her face in his hands the way he had the morning they decided to marry, the way he had on 100 mornings and evenings in between, with the hands of a man who builds things and takes care of them, and she put her hands over his and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for riding before you finished reading." "Thank you," he said, "for sending the letter." Outside, the Colorado stars were doing what they always did, which was occupy the sky in their particular Colorado abundance, from one end of the dark to the other without interruption. The mountains were out there in the dark, the way they always were, constant and enormous, the thing that had made Ruby stop on the station platform on her first day in Dusty Creek and look up with wonder, the thing she still looked at some mornings from the porch with the same quality of being stopped by it. In the kitchen, Jimmy snored faintly in the parlor. Maggie had turned over on the settle and was breathing the deep, even breath of a child in complete sleep. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the house was warm and full and present in the way that only a genuinely lived-in place can be, not just a structure but a container for a life. Levi and Ruby Norris stood in the kitchen of the house he had built and she had made into a home, and the letter from their son was on the table between the coffee cups, and the wedding music from the evening was still somewhere in the air, and they stood together in the way of 2 people who have found their particular person and have had enough years together to know with complete certainty that they were right. The letter Ruby Wainwright had written at a kitchen table in Millhaven, Tennessee, on a quiet night with the lamp burning low and no real expectation of anything, had crossed the country and found its way into the hands of the one person in the world who would read it 6 times and ride before he finished the 7th. And it had become, in its way, the beginning of everything. Not because it promised anything, not because either of them had been looking for a miracle, but because 2 honest people had told the truth to each other across a distance and then had the courage to close it. And that, in the end, was all any love story ever needed to be.